So, Alberto Di Felice, Director for Infrastructure, Privacy and Security Policy at Digital Europe. Please introduce your next panel.
Thank you, Chris. Wonderful. Final panel. I have the honor of having Renate Nicolai. Don't sit there. You're supposed to sit over here. Join me, please, on stage. Deputy Director General, DG Connect of the European Commission. This is what happens when you're the last one to arrive. As usual, I have the privilege of being an Italian and getting to reprimand Germans for being late. Wonderful. So Renate, please. Second German on the panel, Damian Buzalaga, member of the European Parliament. Thank you very much, and one of the key players in the Data Act discussions. And finally, we have another German, Sabine Grappentin, Senior Legal Counsel, Siemens Healthineers, also joining us. Thank you very much. Okay, all my panelists are seated. I can now see it as well. So, so Data Act, I think objectively, after the AI Act, probably the defining piece of digital legislation to have come out of this European Commission. The data strategy at large has been a defining theme of this European Commission, and because we like to think in terms of pillars in Europe, the Data Act is the central pillar of the data strategy. And it's very important. I think the Commission would agree with me that it is so important that if we don't have the Data Act effectively, we don't have a data strategy. And we as industry very much agree with that. And I think one interesting thing, as Chris was saying, is that I think if you consider from the moment the proposal was out to the plan of finishing this by the end of this month, it will have been roughly a year and a half of discussions. If you think about it, for the central pillar of something so important, for something that will last for years and years and years, and will have such a transformative economic impact on the future of Europe, is really not that long time, is it? So I want to hear from Renate, of course. And you've come relatively late to this debate because by the time you joined DG Connect, the proposal was already there. And you also have extensive experience in another field of the big data strategy, data protection, fundamental rights, et cetera. So you know this debate very well. So first of all, I'm going to ask you to explain, also in light of the debate and the legislative discussions that we've seen around the proposal, how the Commission sees the potential. And also, obviously, we've referred to the letter that we co-signed with a number of CEOs, including Siemens Healthineers, about well, right now, there's quite a lot of unease, particularly, again, not only them, but quite a lot of German companies, the locomotive, the powerhouse of industrial Europe, the European economy, about the potential side effects of what could be happening if we open up data with possibly not too much consideration for what this means in terms of opening up unfair competition, potentially cybersecurity risks that should be regarded as part of these discussions. How do you think this can contribute to the discussion, and do you think there is still some leeway perhaps now in the final phase to take these a bit more into account?
Thank you so much for the debate and for having me in it. I think, actually, also giving my background, I think it's quite logical that, for the European Union that has, let's say, in the first part of the digital transition, focused a lot on substantiating the protection of the individual right of data protection, and has then moved on to kind of bring order into the platform economy with the DSA and the DMA, uses this mandate also with the data strategy to really untap the potential of the data economy. And this is very much the driving kind of idea behind the Data Act. And I find this, knowing where I come from, a quite logical step. And I think it's important. And again, we are doing it in a very own way, because what we want to create here is really a data market that is fairer, that allows much more innovation, especially when it comes to the generated data in the context of the IoT system, where we all users will be co-generating data. in an unknown way, in a much more massive way compared to today's activities. And here to kind of look at this market and to say, well, wait a minute, shouldn't we here, a lot is happening already on data sharing, but should we leave it just to the market powers as they are, or shouldn't we come in with a little bit more of a regulatory objective to bring fairness in there, to build on what we saw in the impact assessment work, that there are billions of dollars and euros that can be created by creating a more flourishing data market in Europe and giving users, but also SMEs in particular, third parties, an approach, a possibility to create that more innovative data market. It will be, I think, unraveling the contractual relations as they are today, but this is a little bit also inevitable. If you really want to bring fairness in something that is at the moment dominated very much, when you look at the data economy coming from Silicon Valley, from one owning the data, and I think that we have to break up. That's why I understand that now that we are coming closer to finalizing this very important piece of legislation, there is nervousness in the market. People, see their legitimate interests, for instance, on protected trade secrets, IP rights, and how that will kind of be balanced against certainly an objective that can be shared, that we all want to kind of support innovation in this IoT data generation market. We, I think, are making very good progress in the trilogues to find compromise solutions that would take into account legitimate interests of partners such as Siemens, and that will reply to some extent to the worries described recently in letters from the companies and from associations. But I think what I want to bring home to you nevertheless and to the audience is that there will be change. There will be change in the structures, because if there is not change, then we will not kind of invite every player to kind of think again, and we will strive for innovation, and that's what we don't want to do.
Okay. Okay, let's hear from Damien about where that balance lies, in the sense that I think you've been very, very involved in this discussion, very proactive in trying to find solutions to a number of different things in the Data Act. But specifically, when it comes to creating those, that different balance between creating new things, allowing new players, and disrupting the silos, if you will, from Silicon Valley, but also from Germany. There's a lot of Germany in this debate, I repeat. You've also used this very, very colorful expression that, whatever discussion we have, it shouldn't turn the Data Act into a data suppression act. Could I ask you to elaborate on that very strong expression of concern with this debate? Do you think that this debate is completely fictitious? How careful do you think that the Parliament, you, are ready to go on issues like trade secrets, IP protection, to sort of respond to these concerns coming from industry?
So first of all, thanks a lot for the invitation, and also I have to say that I, with every word that Renate said, I concur. Yeah? I think the objectives we very much share also within this room, and then there are discussions about how to get there and how to balance interest, and I think that's the crucial question we're trying to figure out, in the negotiations right now of how to get there. Earlier there was a discussion. I listened to Kama Atiga also being interviewed, and whether or not we listened enough as legislators. And at least from my side, I've met, I think, with multiple parties, also Siemens Health, and many other stakeholders. And I just want to say that all we are doing is looking at business interests, and they might differ. Yeah? So there is the business interests of the manufacturers, there is the business interests, and you talked about Germany and the complex landscape that we have there, of component manufacturers, of owners of connected devices, and it is a complex landscape. I think, we can think about the balance afterwards, whatever it is, but it will always be in its core, a business versus business kind of balance. Mostly, I think there's a B2C component to it, but I think most of it, where I really think the added value of the Data Act lies, is in the industrial data space. And that's why I would also and this was also said on an earlier panel, really urge all of you to not only put your compliance and risk officers onto analyzing the Data Act, but actually your chief strategy officers, like really thinking about the fact that maybe if the data economy changes in the way that Renate said, there might be new opportunities to enter new business areas because suddenly data could become available that before was not. And I think this is really the perspective. So to answer your question, I think we need to look exactly at what the balance could look like. And I tell you one step where we actually believe that the Commission went too far against the interests of manufacturers, and that is with allowing for in-device access on data. So if you look at the original proposal by the Commission, there was a more stringent proposal that all data that is produced within a device should be accessible for the user. And there we did a big step back in the Parliament's text. So I think we might have differing views on balance, but I think where we fully share the concern is to say that trade secrets need to be protected, that IP obviously needs to be protected, and now the question is to what extent and how do we deal with, for example, an in-EU marketplace, an internal market where we can enforce such protection if it's breached, and how do we deal potentially with geographies where that trade secret protection cannot be basically enforced. And this is, I think, the nuances that we need to look at. But again, I would like to invite you all also to, when you spend all this energy on it, think about how can we as a company use the huge potential that will come if we get from the 5% of industrial data currently being used to 95%. And just the last word on this, if you look at our work in the Data Governance Act, we very much focused on creating one other element, which is the trusted intermediary, so that once we have now created legal clarity, hopefully, on who can share what kind of data without needing a single lawyer to be able to analyze and understand that hopefully we can actually get to a fluid data economy quite fast.
Very good. Without a single lawyer. It's wonderful. I was also hearing from Carmen about ideas of automating all of this. I'm relatively skeptical.
My sister's a lawyer, so I can say that, but I think...
There you go. So thank you very much. So Sabine, you are, Siemens Healthineers is one of the companies that co-signed that letter to the Commission. And also, just like ResMed, you come from a very regulated sector already. You're probably one of the people that will have to deal with both the e-health data space and the Data Act potentially applying at the same time to its operations. When you look at the Data Act specifically, what is the big concern for a company like yours?
Yeah, in principle, also our company, like many associations, agrees with the overall goal of increasing data sharing. Yeah, I mean, we are heading towards a data economy, and also especially in the medical sector, this doesn't work without data. Yeah, that's agreed. The reason why we have an issue with the Data Act, and we have that from the beginning, is because of this trade secret concern that we have. And in order to understand it, maybe it makes sense to have a closer look at the data that we are talking about. Yeah. So you may know us. We are a big medtech manufacturer. We do, for example, MR and CT scanners. And when you look at the scanners, for example, an MRI, they look pretty much alike. You have all those components: patient table, gantry. They have the magnet, the coils, and so on. And so the question is, how do they differ? What is the competitive edge? Yeah? So the competitive edge really lies in the interplay of the components in the way data is processed within the scanner. Yeah? So for example, you take data points from a patient, they get digitized, and then they get pre-processed through various processing steps until they are sort of ready for image reconstruction. Yeah? And basically, in that process, prior to image reconstruction, yeah, this is where MRIs differ from each other and where there is the competitive edge. Yeah, the image reconstruction, then it's a mathematical process. So I've been told it's sort of some kind of transformation, which is the same for all companies. But the competitive edge and the relevant technology lies in this pre-processing step. and the raw data, the pre-processed raw data that are generated in this process, yeah, they basically carry the trade secrets, meaning the specific technology, and experts, when they get access to this data, they would be able to read it, and basically they would know how we do it, that our machines are better in certain areas than others. Yeah. So, and this is exactly also the kind of data that will need to be disclosed under the Data Act. This is quite clear, for example, from recital 28A of the Council draft. And so this is where our concerns come from. Yeah, I mean, this is one example of data, yeah, that our concern is that we would have to disclose core technology that we do not want to do, also not within the EU, to be very clear. Yeah, I mean, obviously it would be the worst disaster if this kind of information is disseminated outside of the EU, but even within the EU we have stiff competition, and obviously we would like to keep it this way. This is not the only kind of data that machines produce. Obviously, there is sort of the specific user data proper. This is about patient throughput, you know, specific user configurations, the extent of the use, anything you need to know about fleet management. So there is also this kind of user-specific data where we would not have any issue of sharing it. Some of it also you know, embodies trade secrets of our customers. But there is also this kind of very closely device-related data that is not just any kind of data, but that really carries the core secrets, the core know-how of our technology. And then obviously you also have this data, which is also equally important for servicing, that comes out of the machine run. So this is the famous sensor data, like, I don't know, old temperatures of tubes and number of revolutions in the TT system or whatever. So that is data that is very important for servicing. Also this kind of data, when you have it, an expert can read it and they know how our machines then works, and they will get access to our competitive edge. Yeah, and this is our concern, and this is also why we think that this ex-post protection that is currently in the Data Act with, you know, first of all, you share the data, and then we look at security measures, and maybe at some stage we also try to prevent the data from getting to countries outside of the EU. Well, this is why we think it's probably not sufficient, because once the data is out, it's out. It's like the box of the Pandora, yeah, it's once the data, because trade secrets, by definition, they are not IP protected. Their value lies in being secret. Yeah, and so basically, this is our major concern with respect to the Data Act. Yeah, and the data sharing foreseen by the Data Act, it really would allow aggregation. So the concern is not one single data transfer, but the concern is the possibility of data aggregation from many machines over a long period of, or over a certain period of time, which the more data get out, the more open our technology would be.
Thank you, Sabine. I saw Damien wanted to react already.
Yeah,
I'll let you do that. I mean, you guys are all German, so you're all very civilized,
also
so you can improvise. Yes, yes, absolutely.
We can do it in German as well. No, so I think for me, what's super helpful to think about is what differentiates a product or device from a connected product or device. Yeah, because we are regulating connected devices and not devices as a whole. And I think the difference is that the connected device sends data and very often also receives data to be able to fulfill some of its functionality. And that's why I said in my earlier statement that we're not trying to say that all devices that have data within them should share all their data with the outside world. And I think that's a very crucial and important information, because what kind of tube, you know, or coiler, or, you know, raw data is being produced, at least in Parliament's position, we are saying this is completely your black box, basically, to deal with, and it's of nobody's concern. What is of concern, or like what should be in scope of the Data Act, is the data that leaves the device. And this is a design choice by the manufacturer. And here is, I think, where basically, you know, the manufacturer could choose whether they want to transfer raw data or very sophisticated data, because in some Raw data doesn't exist, by the way. I think it's 0 and 1s, and then you have sophistication levels. But you know, like for some companies, and this is important, the Data Act is a horizontal law for all connected devices. Yeah? So, and this is something that we really try to show in the complexity of the Parliament's amendments. For some devices, the trade secret lies in the raw data, and you just gave a perfect example, I think. And for some devices, the sophistication, or like the trade secret lies in the process data. And so what we are saying is it should be up to the manufacturer to decide what kind of data sophisticate, or like how sophisticated the data is that leaves the connected device, and only this data should be in scope. But as Renato also said, you know, we need to, there will be change, but there should be a possibility for all the parties involved to deal with this change. And I hope that with this approach, we will be able to actually, address a lot of these concerns.
Very good. Very important points. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe to come also to this very pertinent kind of concern, and we have heard that before. So you've made your point very well. I think indeed, you know, I've done a lot of legislation already, and never ever does the legislation that is finally adopted, you know, resemble entirely to the proposal that has come out of the Commission. And especially in such a groundbreaking and innovative kind of piece such as the Data Act, this is a learning process also for the co-legislators. So I think to give you some comfort, Damien has just said that there's already, when it comes to the scope, clarifications that have been brought in by the deliberations in the Parliament and with their position. And on your point that you made that, you know, the original proposal was too much exposed when it comes to the kind of the balancing on the trade secrets, you might have seen that here the Council has actually in their deliberations, you know, added a handbrake, you know, so sort of a stop. A red sign, stop, halt, I don't kind of share this data because I have very legitimate kind of concerns. So these are the kind of things that we are playing with now in the trilogue, and I think they are all very important venues to pursue further in order to come to that, you know, balanced approach and balanced outcome that would not take your competitiveness edge away, but nevertheless, you know, open the gates for more data sharing.
Okay. In the meantime, people have been relatively active on Slido, and I have very interesting questions, which I'll have to combine to some extent because we don't have enough time. So people are asking, for example, what type of players would benefit from the Data Act obligations? It appears that there's a lot of people who don't want to share data, potentially confidential data. I think the interesting thing here is that in the debate about connected devices is an interesting one because, first of all, these days there's not a lot of devices that are not connected. And also part of this debate has been the automotive industry, right? Think of a car. A lot of cars are connected. Many cars are not connected, but the aftermarket folks in the value chain have always wanted to get access to the data, connected or not, for the purposes of doing whatever it is that they want to do in after sales. Clearly that's a big part of the debate. We usually talk about these examples, right? The automotive market is a very clear example. Everybody talks about it. But even if you go back to the impact assessment study that supported the proposal, one thing that struck us is that it's fairly anecdotal. Right? There's a good number of interviews of people that believe there are opportunities out there. So it's all fairly hypothetical. We haven't really seen big numbers about what the economic plus could be on the new players that would be impacted. On the other hand, you have very big industrial players who you could say have been sitting on the data. I think that's an unfair characterization because, you know, it's, you know, they've been providing devices, they've been providing services based on those devices, but they are, again, the powerhouse of Europe, and they fear that, you know, the future is uncertain for them. So how do you balance that? Have you actually looked at the economic opportunity, or are you basing this on like a good faith belief that, of course, if you open up data, something good is going to happen?
You asking me?
Yeah. I mean, that's also for Renate, isn't it?
Look, in the end, the use cases, the people who can imagined use cases will be the ones who will innovate and will be able to basically reap the potential that we are trying to put out there. And it's always the question of, who's the innovation driver? Will this be new players? I think sometimes what we lack is the representation of future industries, because this whole discussion about future generations don't have a voice. I think there is a huge potential, and I can just give you a couple of examples, but in the end, many of these examples haven't been thought about because the data that is available from different players has never been brought together and nobody could actually have a holistic picture on that. So let me give you one random example. But if you would share windmill data of windmills that are close to airports with airlines and basically who are running the airplane, so the moment when airplanes apparently use most of their gasoline is when they land because they have to go with full throttle against the speed that they were going, and this is dependent on the wind speed that would that's around in that area. So I mean there are obviously sensors already on the plane, and there are sensors on the airfield. But if you had maybe additional information about the wind speed, maybe you would be able to gauge that, and save some energy there. You said it. It's anecdotal. It's anecdotal because I think we still need to see how all the different data that's out there can be used to create new products and services by people who just come out of university maybe, or even big companies. And that's why I said you should all, no matter your size, think about the data that could become available with the Data Act and think about how this could also improve your business operations. Yeah? I think it's important to understand that the biggest innovation power still lies with those who have, the biggest departments and knowledge in their field. So I think there's a big potential also for incumbents to innovate with data that maybe before wasn't available. And specifically actually with component manufacturers, I would say, who currently very often do not have access to any of the data that is being produced by, the product that was sold by an OEM later on.
Okay, thank you. Let me build on top of that, and then Renate can jump in. I think nobody denies that there's a lot of potential in data sharing. I think the problem here is you're not just telling people that it would be beneficial for you mutually to share data, and there's a lot of potential there. The problem is that you're telling them immediately that thou shalt share data and thou shalt do it in a certain way. I think this is where people get a bit antsy. Renate.
Well, first, I would kind of argue against your kind of complaint that our impact assessment is based on anecdotal evidence. I would really not support that. I think this is a serious piece of work of impact assessment as we do in the Commission, because we follow very much the better regulation principle. I would also argue that your position is a little bit one-sided because you pretend that it's the kind of the big industry's end, the kind of the Data Act. There is another side to the story, and that's the kind of component industry was mentioned. That's the kind of the backbone of a lot of kind of economic systems in the member states are SMEs. And SMEs are actually quite happy with the idea of the Data Act. And as some firms have written to us with their concerns, we have also received respective statements from, in particular, the SME side to say, carry on, because you're really on the right track with the Data Act. So it's really this balancing kind of act. So how do you create a market? It's a philosophical question. Do you do it by simply kind of leaving space, leaving decades? Do we have the time for that? Or will we again totally depend on solutions, innovations being driven elsewhere? And I think with the realization that looking back now, we were too much. And that I can say that because I'm also in charge of enforcing DSA and DMA. We were too much hands off on the platform economy. I think, it's quite interesting that here in this kind of context, we now, in a European way, it's not a dictate that is totally unfair to one side. It's a kind of an offer to kind of, help sectors to look also for innovative, contractual, fair contractual solutions. That's what this is about. This is not kind of sharing without getting anything in return. This is about, sharing arrangements that make sense, but that would also open space for innovation. That's very much how I see the philosophy of, the regulatory approach in the Data Act. Yes, it's a regulatory approach driven by experience that we have kind of made in this kind of almost, 20, 30 years of digital transition that we are observing, trying to make it better this time.
And there's one more factor which I think is important. You said we are forcing companies to share data. Yeah? I think it's a bit simplistic. Nobody in their company has to share any data because of this regulation with someone outside. To make this very clear. Here it's about the question of a relationship of two parties, or maybe three. The owner who has the property of the product is the one side, and then there is someone who's operating that product. So to just say, like, look, you're forcing one side to share data is too simplistic, because in the end you have a relationship and we're weighing the interests of these. And I think that just needs to be also clarified.
Yeah. I'll reformulate. You're forcing one side to share data if someone asks. But let's do that. You talked about an offer to help, right, Renate?
Yeah.
Sabina, do you see that as, the legislators offering you help in your efforts to use more data in your operations? Do you see the Data Act that way?
I don't think so. I mean, you just mentioned it. I mean, there is some kind of, it's a regulation which also will force companies, manufacturers to share data under certain circumstances. For example, when a user, meaning a customer, asks for it. So there is, in my opinion, there is clearly a regulatory element there, and it's intended to be like that. And the concern that I would have in that respect is it goes towards, the manufacturer has the choice to determine which data should go out of the device, because then they will need to be shared if a third party, including a competitor, asks for it. My concern here would be, data economy cannot live without data. So we need actually an incentive for data generation. The way this is set up at the moment, it's more an incentive for, at least on the manufacturing side, also looking at these trade secret topics. Especially looking at the trade secrets topic, it would more an incentive to avoid the generation of data, because then it will immediately need to be shared. Yeah, and it's regarding, you mentioned the handbrake mechanism. That might be a suitable way, because it's also an ex ante right of refusal. But obviously, if the threshold is so high that you basically need to be shortly before bankruptcy, as it's at the moment in the council draft, then it doesn't help so much, because we will not come close to non-economic viability just by sharing one set of data. So the way the council text currently stands, the principle is correct. We need ex ante protection. Once the trade secret is out, it's out. So we need the right to refuse. But the thresholds, the way they are at the moment, they are really far too high.
Okay. I think we have 5 minutes, and I want to dedicate the 5 minutes to one last question. And again, let's go back to older regulation. GDPR. I think we're just back from the celebrations last week. 5 years, a lot of celebrations about the success, finally, of the one-stop shop, how long it took to get there, to get some level of consistency in how the DPAs interpret critical provisions of the GDPR and enforce them. And now all of a sudden we have a new framework that sort of combines personal, non-personal, depending on what parts of the text you're looking at. Certainly, if you're talking about personal consumer devices, there's a lot of personal data in there. And how do we think that, to use your words, Damien, we're going to get rid of lawyers when, on top of the GDPR, we'll possibly have to interpret and enforce data sharing under the Data Act, and we may have different interpretations about the legal basis for sharing and that sort of thing. How do you think we're going to do it?
So I'm very happy you bring this up, because I have a little personal trauma with GDPR. And I still think it's good. Yeah? So I'll explain to you why. When we founded the movement Volt, which maybe also explains why I'm more like on the innovators perspective, but we were half a year old when GDPR went into force. And as a movement, the sole thing that you have to do is you have to communicate with all your newsletter subscribers to make them donate or like come to events or whatever. And we couldn't for 3 months. And I asked a GDPR lawyer if they could help us set up this audit trail, blah, blah, blah. And they said, no problem, it'd take us 2 days and each day costs 5,000 euros. And we were like, we don't have that cash. We literally didn't have a single euro at that time to spend on anything. So this cost us 3 months of like figuring out until we had a volunteer who was able to. So that's why I care so much about regulatory precision. The more you say, like in this case, if the company is in a risk of bankruptcy, then you do not need to share. Blah. No, I think it needs to be very clear. If I get access to certain data, what kind of data can I share on a data market without having to care about being sued later on? Like, it needs to be, the regulation, I think, that is not so much about balance. This is about clarity. Like, it needs to be easy understood when you read it, and we shouldn't, and this was from the beginning my goal also, trying to really talk to all the stakeholders, including businesses, in a way that to find out how can we make this as clear as possible. And I understand, just to react to this, the concern that manufacturers would have less incentives to actually make the connectivity of their products extensive, like reduce the data that's being shared. I thought about this very hard, and we discussed this a lot, and we came to the conclusion that there is an added benefit in connected devices. And a competitor can say, look, you will, in a device that I will give you, you will have more data that you will get out of it. And so it will allow you to share more on a data market, and data will have a value. So there is a competition between manufacturers, hopefully, on saying, okay, I will, with my device, you have more to share, with mine less. But I do not want to rein into the manufacturer and force them to share any data that they don't want to, just because of the concerns that were just brought up.
Absolutely. We have 2 minutes. Renata, you absolutely deserve the last word on the matter. So please, any thoughts there? GDPR, legal certainty, what are we getting ourselves into?
First of all, when we adopted the GDPR, I remember very well that there was really a fear that this would destroy innovation in Europe, that it would be the end of the SMEs in Europe, even though this was a revision of a 20-year-old directive, and it was only kind of an update to make it, future-proof. And nothing of that happened. I think history has proven us right, that it was right to do an update of the GDPR, which has become really an inspiration for many in the world. Since then, of course, we have, made much more progress on regulating the digital space. And in all the pieces that we have done, we have made it crystal clear that it has to be built on the foundation of the GDPR. And I've just been on a panel yesterday, also with a DPA and a data protection authority. It's very clear that if we want to make these different digital regulatory pieces work, we also have to create a structure whereby the authorities kind of need to work hand in hand. And I think it will actually be a very interesting role also for the DPAs to follow in the enforcement of the GDPR, this kind of emerging data economy. So for me, it's clear the coherence has to be there. That's what we also have written in the Data Act. That's what we are writing in all the other digital pieces. And I think they will live in perfect harmony once the Data Act is adopted.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's very hopeful. Let's see. I think we'll have a longer discussion for years and years to come when it comes to enforcement and the many authorities that are popping up and how they will have to coordinate. But on that note, unfortunately, we only have 40 minutes. That's way too short for this very interesting panel with very articulate speakers. But we'll have to close. So thank you very much to all my speakers, to the audience for being so patient, and of course, now Cecilia.